they discover that it's all the same, this identity or that. Anyway, point is, elites dislike movement. White elites are thrown out of the country, yet everyone is still sitting in their assigned caste places. Some of you have hundreds of acres of land. Your ancestors were rewarded with land, pampered by generations of kings, brown as well as white. Even those who couldn't keep their backsides attached to the throne without the help of mercenary soldiers, they doled out land as reward, and they took it away as punishment. You think you inherited your land because of your talents? How many of you would pass a farming test? The bell will ring in 10 minutes. No need to look at your watch, Yashika. That's the third time you've looked at it. Stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie. Here's a line that I wish I had written, but unfortunately it was written by my friend who passed away recently, Roberta Colasso, and it really sums up for me the book. It says, never state the thing, but the resonance of the thing. Prelude to a Riot. The whole book is in every which way a prelude. And yet, to me, your book seeds with a kind of oppressive silence. And I have this comment that I want you to respond to. You know, there is the hot afternoon in literature. Literatures across cultures have a hot afternoon. Often finds itself described as one that is full of the noise we equate with extreme silence and the heat. Each one of these heated noon silences have at least a fly or a bee buzzing. It struck me that this need urge to add sound in the form of a universal buzz is an attempt perhaps at warding off evil or falling prey to it. Your prelude offers instead a kind of, and these are your words, rumble under the earth for those who choose to hear it. Nothing happens on stage, on page, and yet, as a reader, I am visited, inhabited, possessed by anxiety, and the waiting itself becomes an act of violence, and our first victim is empathy.
Thank you, Naveen. You know, with writing this book particularly, I didn't set out to write this book. I had been traveling to a new place, and that place was very beautiful and very calm on the surface. I had gone to talk about and to learn about labor laws, agricultural labor, and the difference between one part of the country, and for example, comparing East India to South India to Western India, what are the wages like, labor migration patterns. Those were the things I was interested in. When I got there, I sensed this thing that you're talking about, this rumble under the ground. It came to me in the form of conversations, and usually these were one-sided conversations, partly because I was hearing, I was listening and absorbing, and people were just talking at me. And it was very distressing, partly because it is very hard to communicate to someone this thing that you fear, because there's nothing you can point to. There is no specific act of violence. There is no particular, there is no riot, right? There are no cases filed. It's nothing. You can't haul up everybody. You can't rail at everybody before the thing has actually happened. And yet you know that something is happening. So I paid closer attention to what was happening, not just there, all around, in all areas where I sensed that there is tension. I began to pay closer attention to the conversations I was hearing. And you're right also in that the moment of heat actually does precede real violence. I do find real violence is often sort of inevitable. All the drama has happened before the main act of violence, any kind of violence. It could be an individual murder, an act of passion, or it could be a riot. But everything that had to have happened, that led up to this moment, has already happened. And I was interested in that, in all the little things that are slowly aggregating, each little thing building to the next thing, building to the next thing, and creating that moment of heat, which will finally set off the spark, and anything could happen after that. I am particularly interested in the silences that you mentioned are often the silences. That is partly why I think, now that I think about it, I wasn't aware of it when I was writing it, but now I think about it, I think I chose the form of the soliloquy, the monologues. Part
Hmm.
of it also comes
Yeah,
from theater training.
yeah.
I chose that form because there is silence, because I knew the conversations I was hearing, but I wanted to get inside the head of those conversations and all the events that possibly lie around those conversations. What really goes on inside a person's head? Those were the conversations I wanted. Even in the case of Garuda, for example, he talks to his class, but so much of it is just stuff that's in his head. He just
Mm.
goes on and on, whatever's in his head, he just spits it out. So I was interested in that, in capturing that, in all the things
Mhm.
that people think but don't always say.
Yeah, for me, Garuda almost, it's so strange, but it was almost like, I think the word soliloquy triggered it off, but he's such a Hamletian figure in my head, or somewhere between Hamlet and Beckett. There's a kind of, I mean, even as the book proceeds, and we know that there is this, his eventually being asked to leave the school, for example, the drinking, as it were, and all the rest of it. It's this, it's like for me, it was something that you chose not to do. Let me try and explain this, which is that as a writer with an intuitive sense of a kind of injustice, justice, right, wrong, all of these things that preoccupy sensitive people, um, there's a kind of sense that when you use these words like absorbing, like blows, observing, absorbing, I would add transmitting. I would even add translating that into an act of resistance by writing what you did. He fails to do that. He's groping in that sense, Hamletian. I mean, he kind of almost, he sees it. He probably gets us as readers to see it first and foremost, that this is what's coming, which we hear about later as a refrain, not necessarily from him. But I mean, the sense that the intolerance that is no longer at simmer, it's kind of boiling over. And at least now, very specifically in our country, it's. I think the rumble has kind of, is no longer just a rumble, right? And therefore, to have a book that's almost Cassandra-like, it says there's, you saw it coming. So thank you.
Thanks, Naveen. Garuda's character, I made a history teacher, partly because I've become very interested in history. When I was a kid, I was not interested. I was probably the students in 10B thinking, sitting there and thinking, what is this about? Just dates and kings and battles, and why are they important? I was least interested. I have got interested in history very late in life, maybe only in my late 20s and 30s, when I finally woke up to the contestations of history. Our sense of self, the Indian sense of self, was being fractured and being contested. Who is Indian? Who is not Indian? What is a good Indian? What is a bad Indian? What is the kind of what portions of Indian history are more valid or less valid? Who deserves to be remembered in what way? Suddenly, that became our whole politics became about that, and I was kind of stumped at how this happened. I didn't see that coming as a kid. I certainly didn't. Um, but when I when I started to think about it, my last two books have been sorry, not books. My last play was also very heavily interested in history, and I think that the narratives, that the stories, what is history? History is the stories we tell ourselves, right? Garuda is trying to get the students to think about which version of history they choose to accept and what version they just, for example, in the bit that I just read out, this whole conversation around merit. is kind of, it's such a classroom conversation. It's a thing that students talk about all the time. Merit, admissions, who gets what in society, and how much of that is deeply invested in history. Uh, when you talk about reservations, for example, or you talk about merit, who deserves what in society? How do we deserve a land? I mean, so many property people inherit houses and land, and what is the merit in that? We don't. We don't obviously do any of the actual farming, but the children will inherit anyway. So I wanted to also mesh all of these things, because we tend to look at religious conflict in isolation, but I've slowly come to see that it is no point trying to see one thing in isolation from another. I mean, religious conflict, caste conflict, class conflict, all of them are kind of all meshed together. And Garuda sees that. He doesn't know how to get the students interested. And he knows that they're kind of running out of time. He's running out of time himself as a not only as a citizen, but he's also running out of time as a teacher. He's an alcoholic and he knows it. I mean, there's no hiding it. But I think that through Garuda, I was trying to convey some of the urgency of the need to make at least future generations think a little bit about history, and how to challenge easy narratives. Like, history doesn't offer us anything easily.
And also, the book also suggested to me that the role of us as so-called bystanders, I mean, the word bystander is not new. We've, historically seen this in all the major, World War II, for example, Germany, and so on and so forth. The fact that you didn't participate or appear to be neutral, or the time in history where you feel that this doesn't affect you, right? And that's Garuda's battle too, to get these kids to come up with their own stories and choose the ones that matter to them, and therefore shape, not in some desperate patriotic manner, but just to shape just their individual futures, which then will mesh in with the larger national, patriotic, or whatever notions. And so, I mean, I would be interested to hear a little about us hypocrites, this sort of dailiness of hypocrisy that this again is a thought from one of your conversations. And I get the sense that there is no such thing as an innocent bystander. Again, it's not a unique new thought, but this blindness that historically constantly envelops different cultures, different lands, and makes these things happen, these periods in history. So what does it mean to inhabit literature, which you clearly have done? Family, parents, mother, education, grandfather, all of that. But I mean, what does it mean to be able to write in these times, and the role of having to negotiate and deal with people who just stand and say, no, this will sort itself out. We're just watching. We weren't responsible for what was coming.
But yeah, you're right. There are no innocent bystanders, especially in times of crisis. I think there are times when people don't quite know what is happening. For example, in the book, a character like Dada, I mean, I would call him an innocent because he doesn't really know what's happening. The only action he can take is perhaps try and save himself. But he has this very little that an old man can do when trouble is brewing around him, So I do think that there are people in our society who do their best to give their best to society. They raise their children right, they offer the right values, etc. And bad things still happen to them. That is one of the greatest tragedies of life, and also perhaps some of the most searing stories that come out. I mean, you mentioned, for example, World War II, there was the Holocaust. You hear these narratives, and some of the survivors are just really gentle people. And I mean, a book like, for example, Man's Search for Meaning, Man's Quest for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. I mean, he's just a psychoanalyst, right? And the only thing he does in this way, when things are getting bad, he takes one decision, and that is all. He takes the decision to not leave when he can, because he thinks about his old father. He says, I can't leave him alone and go. Where will I? What will happen to him if I go? Now, his moral intervention here is to stay and suffer whatever is happening around him. He will suffer as others suffer, right? And he comes out of it alive, and he writes this book, and he speaks about, then after something so terrible has happened and you survived that, what does life still mean? So he tries to tell the story, and we read the stories now, and they're searing. And I often think about this, about responsibility, about purpose, about being where you are. I mean, none of us control our circumstances. We just find ourselves here. Now that we are here, and now that things around us are certainly not ideal and very quickly getting worse, now what is our purpose? Some of us try. You publish books, I write books, some people organize conversations, some people try to keep the conversation going in society, just as a way of trying to somehow get people to think in new ways. But however, having said that, I think the vast majority of people out there are silent, and they're silent perhaps for deeply selfish reasons. And such people are all around us. Sometimes we see them, and not just in matters of religious conflict, for example, or people who are not actively trying to foster bonds, but the kind of people who are so self-involved that they make no room for the little battles that must be fought every day. I'll give you a small example. Muradabad was in the news yesterday, or maybe the day before. There was this news about a certain colony, one news report, quote unquote, said posh colony. Maybe it wasn't posh, but it was predominantly an area where there were no Muslims, basically. Two people who could afford to buy houses there bought houses, Muslim families. There was an organization that got together and raised this campaign, threatening an exodus, building political pressure, forcing people who had actually purchased those houses to sell out and vacate again. An exact same kind of situation had developed in Gujarat a few years ago. I remember very clearly. It was by the book, so to speak. One family had enough money to buy in an area, a Muslim person, a man, where there were no other Muslims. He would have posed, he or she or that family would have posed no risk. They would have been the ones at risk, being alone in where there was no other community, etc. Similar pressure was built up. Similarly, the person had to move out. Not only was there no political intervention, there was not enough civic society intervention. In a reasonable society, in a free society, if we are as a people, as a nation, if we are free in the way that our constitution guarantees, we should be able to fight this sort of thing. And if we had fought this sort of thing when it first was reported, similar people would not have been emboldened to do this over and over again. Distances and misunderstandings in society are partly created through active segregation. You segregate communities. I mean, this is that street, this is the Potter Street, this is the Broker Street, this is the Butcher Street, etc., etc. And one community will be completely shut off from another community. And it is the sort of thing which has to be resisted, certainly by leaders and the administration, for sure, that has to be resisted, but also by each individual. How is it that a whole city remains silent while a group of 5 or 10 or 50 people claim to speak up for all of them and allow such things to happen? I wouldn't call, in such situations, it calls, the only thing that will succeed in preventing worse things from happening is if people themselves stand up and say that, don't speak for us. This is not us you're speaking for. But if they are speaking for, if people who are not necessarily threatening violence, I mean, but to threaten a so-called exodus it is a kind of emotional and social violence. If you are enacting that, and if the majority is silent about it, then you're left to assume that those handful of people do in fact speak for the majority. And one certainly cannot say that any of them are then innocent bystanders, except maybe children.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, this is the innocence of Dada is very difficult. It's kind of different from the way one is using bystander here, because he's very much part of, I mean, he's in the thick of it. And his innocence comes from a culture, a tradition, an education, a set of values that he inhabits, which he also tries to pass on. And so therefore, a very thin dividing line between, in my head, a certain kind of historically forgivable innocence and the innocence of people like us who will not stand up and resist or be counted or actively participate in whichever, as you said, chosen field of activity, either as, not just writers, but or publishers or whatever, but as people who, in their dailiness, I mean, your character, the migrant laborer, Mohammed, it's, I mean, that one wonderful piece that, where he's, that whole sort of spending a lifetime of adulation for this film star who turns politician. Maybe I'm tempted if you would sort of read a little of that.
From that section? Okay.
Yeah.
Right, just give me 1 second. So this character is called Muhammad, but everybody calls him Mohammad because they mispronounce it. Yeah. And he is new in this area. And gosh, 1 second. When he was a child, he was completely obsessed with this movie star, and he remains obsessed in a way. But when he was a child, he was especially obsessed. I will just. Yeah. So what has happened, I'll just establish what's happened here. I'll read from the beginning. This is Mohammad Saleh Lokhi. He has 1 day off and he's gone to this rally, this political rally, because this film star he admires so much is sitting with the various politicians and he's attending the rally. So he's basically going to see the film star, not the politicians. Hero, Act 2. Old lion is in town. Ha! What madness came upon me. I ran all the way back after seeing the poster in town, calling out to this one and that one, uncle, son. My wife's eyes smiling. All those dialogues I used to whisper in her ears in the evenings were from his films. She knows what it means to me. Old lion is in town. Oh, the noise I made. My mother had thrashed me because of this man. I used to steal 2 rupees every day to watch his films on the big screen. Sitting on a mat with rocks poking your arse, for that you want 2 rupees? My mother would scold and twist my ears. Once she had even placed a burning coal on my palm as punishment for stealing, but I kept doing it until she put her head on my shoulder and wept. The same damn story. How many times will you steal for the same thing? 7 times you've been. Watch it from a distance, can't you? So then I began climbing a tree to watch the film 1 more time, this time for free, lying flat on my belly so the tent man could not count my head in the dark. The things I used to do to watch this man in action. Madness. Who cared about the story? It was always the same story. The hero was strong, so what if he was poor? Or he was rich, but he was unhappy despite all his wealth. He would fight 20 men. He would love a good girl, so what if she was poor? Or a rich girl would love him. He would spout dialogues that inflamed your tongue like bad liquor. What dialogues! The words he spoke on screen would open up all the wounds of one's heart and then sew them back. Those words were like alcohol rubbed on your wounds. It would sting, but it would also clean your heart. And sometimes they were like rose water on the eyes, or like meat, fleshy, juicy, full of the power of marrow. You felt those words go down smooth and sit inside the hollows of your bones. I could die for those words, steal for the man who gave those words tongue. My fists entered his fists when he picked himself up from the dust, blood trickling down the side of his mouth. His kicks entered my sleep. How I kicked about at night after I'd been to a night show. Now he was coming to town, my hero. I would see him for free at the rally. His face was on all the posters. Older, true, but not too old. The photo was at least 10 years old, I could guess. It's from the time when he was doing all those punching, kicking films. Then he became the heroine's father. Who wants to watch fathers trying to be funny? I once spent 5 rupees on one of his later films, but never again. Still, to see the real man, the thought set me on fire. I went around saying to everyone, let's go, let's all go. Fool, 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 fool. I said, forget the day's wage. We'll go to the rally. The boss will understand. Can't we go to a rally too? It's open. The public is invited. It said so on the poster. I'll stop here. Basically, what happens is that by the end of it, he is deeply disappointed because he thought about the hero as, this guy who's the hero. He's the ideal man, speaking up for the poor and the downtrodden and all that. Ultimately, he turns out to be not only a politician, but a politician who is aligned with the kind of people who basically hate people like Mohammed, migrants, his kind of people. So the rest of the story is about what happens.
Yeah, it's an interesting, very interesting character, because for me, it is what we're all feeling now, right? Whether we choose a hero or which, it doesn't matter who we choose, but the sense of being let down, and it kind of permeates. It's sort of actually, one almost feels responsible in a sense, again, because we never saw it coming, and yet we should have. So there's this constant thing to me throughout of a certain kind of blindness through these soliloquies, in a sense. That's not like, yeah, and this wonderful writerly thing of not really talking to each other, and yet, the resonances are pieced together by us as the reader. I think because I'm very keen that you read the wonderful Dada thing, I just wanted to read 3 short texts that I wrote for you as a tribute to the book. And I hope they work for you. And all of them were written when I first read it. Black head on a stick, struck sharp, the fire, burning, devouring, animated assassin, raging through the rooms, tongue-lashing lizard-like, flames sprouting from the floor like a nightmare. The eyes of the fire searching for the little girl it had taken a liking for.
Thank you so much.
And to think it had begun life as a tiny match, flared matchstick, torched the sky, smoke-filled clouds abandoned on a whim. And finally, dig a grave and bury your grief. It was like, for me, it's what can I say?
Well, thank you so much for writing these, Naveen. These are beautiful, and especially very powerful. Thank you. You've kind of.
And just before we go into the many questions that I'm noticing on chat, would you end with our part of it with the wonderful Dada soliloquy?
So Dada is Farida and Abu's Dada. He is, these two children have, I mean, Abu is a senior student, he's a college student, and Farida is in school. And what's happened here is that one of the things that they've been taught about is the blood moon, that one night there's supposed to be a blood moon. And Dada doesn't know what a blood moon is. He refuses to believe that such a thing exists. So the three of them, Dada with these two grandchildren, they go up to the roof of the house and they look for the blood moon all night. And it's, for him, it's a great experience. And here's what he says. The moon looked at us deep and long. It looked between the gaps in my teeth, found the black thread of doubt raveled into my throat, and pulled it out clean. I was free. What a glorious dawn. All night we were up on the terrace, my two precious ones and myself, wrapped in a quilt made of their mother's old saris. The sky was like an oven, slowly warming to the first bread of the day. The night sky, a lump of burning coal, now gold, now fiery red. By the time we came down from the terrace, the quilt was damp with dew. Both grandchildren were wide awake. Such a precious night that I led them out for a little walk. First, we walked round the house, and I pointed out once again all the different flowering plants, which ones their mother had planted, and which ones my own wife had planted. We walked further to the edge of the plantation, this piece of land that my father bought and cleared with his own hands, and which I have sown and watered with my sweat. The dog was with us, his breathing loud. It gives me peace to hear that happy dog. My poor boy, his mind is soaked in fear. Last night, when we were up on the terrace, Farida had fallen asleep for a few moments. He started talking again about what is coming. It may seem like it is light years away, but this sort of thing, it travels at the speed of light. It will be here one night at our gates, and then? You think we can save anything? Not even this little dog. I asked, what are light years? He buried his face in his hands. I asked again. I said, I'm an ignorant man. I did not go to college like you, and whatever little I learnt in school, I have now forgotten. All I know is this land and its riches. Pepper, bananas, coffee, rice. This is what I understand. Now, what are light years? So he told me. I tilted my head back and looked up into the night. Tinsels of light, as long as the gaze could go. And yet, it is a ball of fire, isn't it? Not tinsel. I asked Abu, so every star is a big ball of fire? It is. And when a large ball of fire is headed in your direction, you'd be a fool to not start running. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This was, thank you, Annie. Not very much one can say after that. I think we should, open it up for, there seems to be questions addressed to you. So I'll try and read them from the chat if that's what the host wants me to do. Trying to find the questions. There's some comments. For example, Bodkub says, Jaskiran, the mouthful of pork was especially moving. And innocent bystanders are selfishly motivated, practice the concept of us and not us. Somebody says silence fuels appetite. There's a question, I'm intrigued by the names you've chosen for your characters. There is Miriam, there is Garuda, and there is Derrida. A deconstitutionalist, did you intentionally choose these names and why?
Well, some thought did go into the names. In fact, there's this entire, if you read the book, you'll see some explanation. For example, Abu thinks about why he was called Abu and why Farida was called Farida. You don't know Dada's name because I didn't give Dada a name. He's just Dada. Some thought, yes, went into it. I was playing a little bit with uh, Farida and Abu, especially because when children are small, parents often, Abu's full name is Abu Bakr. Nobody calls him Abu Bakr. They just call him Abu because it's suitable for a little boy, small boy. So that's it. The other characters, yes, because I needed to have names that sort of ring true to that particular geography. So there is Devaki, there is Yashika. Some of these are names which I'd heard in real life, so I kind of knew that they were geographically sort of correct. Garuda I came up with because partly because it's unusual, but also because of that particular character he is. I needed him to stand apart from everyone else. Uh, the community doesn't know what to do with him, a character like that, and he needed a name that is very unusual for that reason also. And the others, well, I some of them were just names that I felt belonged in that book. It's hard to say why I felt that, but perhaps because these are names of either people I knew or people, friends of friends of friends of friends, or strangers I had actually met. So those were the choices. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Annie, I most appreciate your take on the intersectionality of identities, says Bani. How we cannot think of religion without caste, gender, class. Was this conscious to your approach as you were fleshing out these characters?
Well, yes, partly. I mean, some of that happens in the writing, but some of it I was aware of because, for example, uh, gender is one of those things that certain communities take great pride, for instance, that, our girls are very liberated because we send them to school. But you will also see that the same families will also be extremely reluctant to let the girls choose who they marry. Forget outside the religion, they don't even like them marrying outside the caste or anybody at all that they have not chosen for them. And you see women in certain households, educated women, not having any money of their own or not being able to really have a say in things. It's not that they can't speak, it's not that they're not aware of politics or what's happening around them. They just have no say in the family. And for gender particularly, I noticed this that regardless of how powerful or wealthy or poor the community is, with women, they often, in that sense, you can say that some of them at least comprise the innocent bystander. Some of them don't. Some of them are active participants, but some of them would like to say something or try to say something and are shut up very easily, very quickly, partly because of the way gender works in our society. If you express an opinion, you are either shouted down or physically confined or just not allowed to make the sort of choices that would set you free to participate in public life more fully. Something like that does happen to Devaki in the book, and to others in small, limited ways. So I was very keen also on exploring that of what happens in an atmosphere where hate is building up and women are present in that society, and often the contestation is about their bodies and their choice. That is the truth of the contestation. Actually, it is not so much about identity per se. It is often about control of women and property. But to find themselves being misused in that way, and to have no voice around it, and not be able to do anything to stop it, that was something I wanted to do with the book.
Thank you. There's one more question here that says, this is Gurleen Kaur from Mass Communication Department, Guru Nanak Dev University. She says, asks, how do you think your book can be a way for young minds to be the change?
That's not really for me to say. I mean, whether or not the book can whether it has any power. I think it only has as much power as any other book does. Well, I'd like to think that it's a good book, but finally, readers take what they want to. When young readers, when you're very young, for example, when I was very young, I was reading a lot of 19th century British literature. And looking back, I realized that it was quite impactful because a lot of it was actually without the label of it. A lot of it was
Mhm.
about gender and class. Um, all the work, for example, of Charles Dickens, so much of it is about class and the brutality that is invested in a system that is very classist, about the perils of uncontrolled, rampant capitalization, injustice. The works of George Eliot, for example, I read all of that, and I think they were very formative for me, uh, especially when I was a teenager. And I think that's the way literature works for everyone. That if you are at it, if you're not closed to the possibility of being informed, being sensitized, being changed in some way, then the words will somehow do something, and maybe they will shape your worldview. I don't know.
If I may add that, yes, I mean, the whole, because this question in a sense resonates with our history teacher in the book, so to speak, right? Imparting, suggesting without shoving it down people's throats. That's the thing with literature. It's your ability to absorb, right? Change happens over a long time. It's like the way you bring up children. You can't shove things down their throats. You can only lead by intuitive example, right? And then they read that literature around them that they're surrounded by. But yes, thank you. That was very, very wonderful. There's a question for me, which I will request the hosts to, because this is not about me. I'll read the question. It says, my question is from Sir that most English language publishers have a very slim list for translations. The reason often given is that it is an expensive proposition. So how do you achieve so many translations every year? So if you give my email, I would be happy to answer publishing questions. But if anybody else has questions, we have room for one more question or two for Annie. Oh, there's a new one here. Annie, I was struck by this statement in Mohammad's soliloquy in Prelude to a Riot. Those who do not like the way things are done here, they can leave. How do you interpret it in the light of the contemporary situation in India, and how do you make sense of the exclusions and the confluences that exist simultaneously? I think she's touched it, but maybe you want to add something to that.
Well, it's very difficult to make sense of it, in the sense that I think most of the time I'm just gobsmacked like everyone else. Wake up every morning and you're hit by something new. Um, but I do think that some of these things take on a life of their own, but a lot of them actually are not just happening. They are almost always being made to happen. A certain way of causing rifts where there are none, or deepening rifts where there might be some rift in society, instead of healing and encouraging more understanding. Uh, this is how the only way that you can heal a society actually is by actively telling people that there is a need to heal, that there is a rift, and that if we are to function together, that you need to rift, to to do the work and of reaching out to various people, etc. Which I think is, instead of being encouraged, is often discouraged, and this is the great danger that we are in our society. I do what I can, but I'm not very sure that.
And here's a question I've saved up. My apologies, Navpreet. I was saving this to as a kind of rounding off thing. This is Navpreet Kaur from Department of Mass Communication, GNDU. I have read about your grandfather being an Urdu poet, but you have tried your hand in English and Hindi only. Haven't you ever considered, thought of writing in Urdu?
No, I have not, simply because I am extremely undereducated. I was not educated in Urdu at all. I didn't even know the script until very recently. I eventually taught myself with some help from friends just about maybe 3 years or 4 years ago. So I'm still learning. My vocabulary is uh, very close to zero right now. I'm not confident enough to do it. I do write a little in Hindi. Sometimes I write scripts, sometimes I write short pieces in Hindi. I do feel confident enough to do that, but not Urdu.
Thank you very much. And now Maja House will present the special gold medal for keeping strictly to the time to Annie Zaidi and Naveen Kishore. Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you.
indeed, Naveen. Thank you very much. And thank you. I mean, it's really set us, I think, into thinking about so many of the things that you brought up, Annie, so quietly today. Uh, I think everyone's taking away a lot from this. But I'm going to ask Bani to give the formal thank you conclusion on
Right.
behalf of Maja House.
Thanks, Preeti, and a big thank you to Annie and to Naveen for what has really been a very layered and thought-provoking conversation. Annie, your book really promises this kind of sharp and brave commentary on the polarized and divided times we live in. And as this conversation has reflected, you do that with a perceptive nuance and sensitivity that is so important when engaging with these issues that you highlighted, whether it's of privilege, of migration, of contestations of history, and these precarious kind of configurations of wealth, caste, and religion that create violent boundaries between us and this kind of imagined them. I really actually appreciate this idea of a prelude of, these quiet simmering tensions below the surface that are almost as menacing as the actual fact of riots, because the build-up, so to speak, is so mundane and has become so normalized in a way. I think there are really important lessons to be drawn here, especially given the current political climate we live in, and I look forward to engaging with your book in greater depth. And I would urge everyone in the audience to get their hands on a copy of this very powerful book. Thank you also to Naveen for your insightful questions and for inviting us to really engage with the form of the book. This visual framing of the prelude that you began with, I think, was very thought-provoking for us. And of course, the very powerful lines that you presented at the end. Your observations and comments have added much depth and texture to this discussion and highlighted important questions that, as Preeti said, we will all think about long after the official end of this session. Finally, a big thank you to the audience for your engagement and participation. We've had many students here from the Mass Media Department of GNDU here with us today, and we hope you will join us for future sessions. Thank you also to Preeti and to the entire Maja House team for organizing this conversation and for allowing us this platform that enables us to have an ongoing engagement with some of the best minds of our time. I would like to invite everyone here to also join us for our next session. Next week on Saturday, the 14th of August at 6:30 p.m., we have a session with Sarappreet Singh, who's a well-known author and podcaster, who will be in conversation with Beena Sarwar and Mandira Nair. They will be discussing Sarappreet Singh's book, The Story of the Sikhs, which promises to be a compelling insight into the history of the subcontinent, as told through the spiritual and historical origins of the Sikhs. Then after that, the very next day, on Sunday, 15th August, which is India's Independence Day, there's a very special session, a retelling of the history of building bridges of friendship across borders by Saida Hamid, who's an author and former member of the Planning Commission, and who has been part of various initiatives like Aman Ki Asha for the last 40 years. There is poetry from across the country celebrating freedom, and we invite all of you to join us for that on Sunday, next Sunday at 6 p.m. Thank you all and see you again.
Thank you,
Thank you
Bani.
very much. Thank you, Bani.
Thank you, Maja House, and thanks, Naveen.
Thank you.
Thank you.